It is a true pleasure to be joined on Bad Faith Podcast today by Mouin Rabbani. You know him as so many millions of people now do as one of the four interlocutors on the now famous viral debate on the Lex Fridman podcast on the side of Norm Finkelstein, who we had recently on the podcast, but also co-editor of Jadaliyya and one of the most important voices that have emerged in conversations around the ongoing siege of Gaza. Welcome to Bad Faith Podcast.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for having me.
I mean, I really mean it. I know that the debate, I guess we'll call it, went viral for a lot of reasons, some substantive, some superficial. But I really do want to convey to you how much I appreciated your tone and some, I think, more undersung points you were able to make. I was saying to Norm Finkelstein recently that I thought your kind of good cop, bad cop tonally ended up being very effective because in these relatively quieter moments, you were so incredibly persuasive. And there could be no argument that it was kind of driven by personal animus or an emotional response or anything like that. And I really do think that some of your moments were some of the best moments during the debate, during which I learned the most. So thank you for that, what I'm sure was a slog of an experience.
Thank you. I would just say it's much easier to be persuasive when you have the facts and history on your side. So I give them the primary credit.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. Speaking of, there are a number of big stories coming out of Gaza. It's almost difficult to keep track of them all, but I did want to cover a couple of bases today, and maybe you can let me know where you'd like to start. I want to talk about the new Plus 972 story that talks about AI that is being used by the Israeli military to target ostensibly militants, but by design has a huge allowance for quote unquote collateral damage and actually has a preference for targeting militants while they're at home with their families, really blowing up, if you will, the human shield argument that Israel has been using. I also want to talk to you about the Damascus attack and the new ruling from the ICJ. But first, maybe we'll start with just a little bit of newsy coverage. There was an interesting exchange on Joe Scarborough this morning in which he pressed the Israeli economic minister over the question of why it is that Israel has funded Hamas. And it was kind of an extraordinary and revealing moment because it was the most sustained questioning I have seen that starts to put the onus on Israel rather than just exclusively Hamas for the power that Hamas ultimately had to conduct October 7th. Let's watch a little bit of that, and I'd love to get your response.
I have always looked at Hamas as Nazis. They're terrorists. Have you always looked at Hamas as Nazis?
Unfortunately, yes, and it was demonstrated October 7 what they do.
Yeah, so you always have. Have most of the Israeli people always looked upon Hamas as Nazis?
Well, you know, some of the people in Israel, because we seek peace, thought maybe one day they will prefer peace than war. October 7.
What about Benjamin Netanyahu? What about him? Has he always looked upon Hamas as Nazis?
Well, you're talking about Qatar or Hamas?
Hamas.
I think that everyone understands that Hamas's charter is to destroy Israel. And by the way, not only Israel.
So you've always known this. I mean, yeah, we know the charter.
Yes.
So let me ask you this question, and I can't get an answer, and maybe we're just not covering it in the press. Maybe you can help me out. Why did Benjamin Netanyahu send the head of Mossad to Doha 3 weeks before the worst attack on Jews since the Holocaust and told Qatar to continue funding Hamas?
I think, if anything, October 7 shattered that concept. And it's my understanding.
But you just said you always knew they were Nazis. I always knew they were Nazis. I would never give. We were always angry that Qatar funded Hasbalah and Hamas. I want to know, why did Benjamin Netanyahu do that? Let me ask you this. Why did Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump know in 2018 the sources of Hamas's illicit funding, and they still did nothing. They wanted that money to get to Hamas. I'd like to know why, because we don't know in America. Have there been any investigations in Israel at this point?
I'm sure we'll investigate it, and I totally agree with you.
When?
That Qatar is a wolf in sheep's clothes, and they're buying their way in.
No. I must correct you. Benjamin
Please.
Netanyahu was asked by the leaders of Qatar, do you want us, Qatar, to give money to Hamas? This was in September. And Netanyahu's representative said, yes, of course. You're feeding that wolf, and you're telling that wolf to feed the Nazis in Gaza.
I think you get the gist, but that wasn't even half of it. I saw a smile creep across your face, or kind of a wry smile as we were watching. What's your reaction to that?
Well, at one level, it's still the occupiers or the victims of the occupied. And in that sense, it really doesn't deviate significantly from the way that the Western mainstream media has been portraying this for many years, and particularly since October 7th. But having said that, it seems that some of the major media organizations are indeed taking their cues from the White House, which at the verbal level has begun to express some criticisms of Israel and some very personal criticisms of Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. And my sense is, they're taking their cues of the political leadership and beginning to ask these critical questions of Israeli decision makers, critical questions that we really, at least in the US mainstream media, haven't seen very much of prior to the past week or two.
Yeah, it's difficult because on some level I found myself smiling. My mouth was agape when I listened to this clip for the first time. But, cynically, I read it as part of the White House project to try to blame everything on Netanyahu as an individual, as opposed to Israel as a country, therefore creating the space to continue to bear hug Israel while making Netanyahu kind of the fall guy for all of the discontent that is now being directed at the White House, at the Biden administration. On the other hand, it seems to me that it is inescapable that in order to do this maneuver, there is a sort of displacement of the total blame that the media and the Biden administration and other previous administrations have tried to put on Hamas for every tragedy, every death, every killing that happens to a civilian in Gaza, and the implication of guilt here now directly from the Israeli government. You can't have it both ways.
Well, exactly. And when you give Israel a bear hug, it's very difficult. I would say it's impossible to simultaneously disassociate yourself from the leader of Israel or from Netanyahu's coalition partners, one of whom openly describes himself as a fascist and a homophobe. Biden has been standing shoulder to shoulder with Netanyahu, with Ben-Gvir, the extreme right Kahanist, who's the Minister of National Security, with Smotrich, the self-proclaimed fascist, who's the finance minister. And you can't stand shoulder to shoulder with these people and pretend that you're distinguishing between the state of Israel and the government of Israel, who's been receiving the weapons that the U.S. has been sending to Israel over the past 6 months. It's not peace now. It's the Israeli government led by Netanyahu, Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, and the rest of that crew. So yes, exactly as you said, the U.S. increasingly isolated on the world stage, increasingly a laughingstock on the world stage, coming under growing criticism domestically, even from senior Democrats in Congress, is trying to create a distinction where none exists.
Yes, not in senior Democrats. You have Condoleezza Rice's former advisor being critical of Joe Biden's refusal to condition aid on, I believe it was MSNBC
Oh,
at some
really?
point
Her as
last
well?
week.
Okay, I'm so sick of hearing how upset President Biden is. The buck stops with him. If he wants to stop arms sales, if he wants to stop the bombs that are indiscriminately killing civilians, he can. He has the power. We don't need him going and his aides going to reporters and talking all back around about how upset they are. What happened yesterday is still going to happen. When at Mika's conference, the head of the Palestinian Red Crescent spoke, and she was incredibly moving. This was in Abu Dhabi, and she spoke about the difficulty of aid getting in the country, period, from the north or south. And she described a process that was kind of like the TSA changing the rules every single day, going through airport security. Until those checkpoints are working and aid is going through, we don't need to be giving any more arms sales or money. It needs to stop. It needs to be conditional. It's ridiculous that it's going on unchecked and unfettered, and we're sitting around and talking how upset we are while we hemorrhage billions of dollars.
Yeah, it's incredible the bedfellows that Biden is losing in this moment. Of course, you also have people like John Fetterman doubling down. He recently, if you really think about it, just days after an American citizen is killed by the Israeli government in this Jose Andres food van drone attack, saying that Biden absolutely should not condition aid, reaffirming his position, having no consideration or even like a moment of pause or hesitation, consider the life of this young father who was just killed by our so-called greatest ally in the region. It does suggest to me that there is a kind of persistent establishment cohort that will not be deterred, and that despite his messaging to the contrary, that Biden is a part of that cohort. I wanted to get your take on Biden's recent statements today. It'll be longer ago by the time people listen to this, but that he is very frustrated with Bibi Netanyahu, and that there should be a, quote, immediate ceasefire.
Well, first, Fetterman yesterday issued a statement along the lines of Hamas wants me to capitulate. I will never surrender, something to that effect. Hamas doesn't even know who he is, and he's placing himself on the front line of this cataclysmic battle between good and evil. They don't know who he is. They don't care who he is. So I really don't understand why he's, it's kind of extreme narcissism to make it so personal on his part. As far as Biden is concerned, as far as other U.S. leaders are concerned, indeed, as far as the leaders of any of the Western states that have stood shoulder to shoulder with this Israeli government as it pursues its genocidal onslaught against the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, as far as they're concerned, I think we're entitled to ignore their words and focus on their actions. It's very easy to say that you're frustrated, that you're opposed, that you want to see change, but those words become entirely meaningless. They become diversionary charades. They become an exercise in smoke and mirrors, when simultaneously you're actually increasing the volume of weaponry, of ordnance that you're sending to Israel, when you continue shielding Israel from international scrutiny, when you continue to dismiss cases that are brought against Israel as being meritless, as Secretary of State Blinken said about South Africa's genocide case, when you continue either vetoing resolutions at the Security Council or abstaining on them because you can't bring yourself to vote for a ceasefire, and then immediately thereafter saying they're meaningless and they're non-binding. When you certify to Congress that Israel has been using U.S. weapons in full compliance, not only with international law, but with U.S. domestic law, which, among other things, prohibits providing military assistance to countries that are interfering with the delivery of humanitarian aid by the U.S. So I think the U.S. has, as I said, it's not only isolated itself on the world stage, but with every passing day, it's becoming a laughing stock on the global stage because of these kinds of statements that have a total disconnect between the expressed sentiments on the one hand, the policy and the actions on the other, and the reality on the ground in the Middle East.
I mean, to that end, you know, if what you're saying is right, and I think it is, that the US is continually thumbing its nose at international law, that it is exposing the farce of it insofar as that there is no enforcement mechanism when you are the most powerful country in the world from a military perspective, then what should we make of this new ICJ order? And can you provide some context for what they've said?
Yes. So the background to this, very briefly, as many people recall, on the 29th of December, the government of South Africa um, issued or put an application with the International Court of Justice in The Hague, accusing Israel of violating its obligations under the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. In other words, South Africa accused Israel of perpetrating a genocide in the Gaza Strip. Um, the, at the time, 17 judges of the International Court of Justice looked at South Africa's evidence, they looked at Israel's rebuttal, and they essentially had to make one of two choices. Either to say there's no case here and dismiss it, close a file, and move on to the next case, or to say South Africa has presented a plausible case. Israel's rebuttal is not sufficiently strong; it's too weak, and so therefore we're going to go to a full hearing to determine whether or not Israel is indeed guilty of genocide. So, on the 26th of January, the International Court of Justice issued what can be seen effectively as an indictment of Israel, with the trial still awaiting. The other thing that the court did on that day is it issued a number of what are called provisional measures. You can think of them as injunctions. It placed certain obligations on Israel and also certain obligations on other states that are parties to the Genocide Convention. South Africa had asked for a ceasefire. It did not. That request was rejected by the court. And in my view, what this case was really about was whether the court would determine that South Africa's application was sufficiently plausible that it would issue what amounted to an indictment, rather than whether it would accept South Africa's request for a ceasefire, because the history here in the genocide cases in Bosnia and Myanmar were that there too, the court rejected a ceasefire order. A month or two later, or in February, I believe, South Africa went back to the court and asked them to issue additional provisional measures because of an impending, what it viewed as an impending Israeli invasion of Rafah and the southern Gaza Strip. And at that point, the court declined to take any additional measures on the grounds that those that it had issued in January, in its view, already covered all of South Africa's concerns. What happened in March is that South Africa once again went to the court, once again asking the court to issue additional provisional measures, this time primarily on the grounds that Israeli policy was creating famine in the Gaza Strip, and that if the court did not act, it would do what is called irreparable harm to the rights of the Palestinians under the Genocide Convention. In other words, that there would be many fewer left whose rights would be protected by the time the court finished hearing the case. And on this occasion, the court looked at the evidence, and it had to determine a number of things: whether there had been a significant change in the circumstances in the Gaza Strip, and whether it was a matter of urgency for the court to act. In other words, to act before the case, the full hearing would commence. And the judges, this time by a vote of 15-1, the only dissenting vote came from the Israeli judge appointed by Netanyahu, to sit on the bench on an ad hoc basis. They determined that there had been a dramatic deterioration of conditions in the Gaza Strip and that they needed to act as a matter of urgency, and ordered a number of additional provisional measures, the most important of which was to order Israel to halt all interference with the provision of humanitarian aid to the Gaza Strip, particularly over the land crossings, and that Israel had to work in full coordination with the United Nations. Seen from a bird's eye view, what this amounts to is a judgment by the court that not only has Israel been violating the initial orders issued in late January, but that its violations had made the circumstances in the Gaza Strip dramatically worse. And it was only on that basis that they had the authority to act. There was a second aspect, which I consider equally significant, is that in this case, 7 of the 16 judges, in other words, just short of half, issued separate opinions indicating that in their view, the court should have also ordered a ceasefire. And they did so primarily on the reasoning that absent a ceasefire, none of the measures ordered by the court can be implemented. But I think they were also influenced by the concluding section of South Africa's most recent application, where South Africa reminded the court that in the Bosnia case, they had been asked to order a ceasefire. The court declined to do so, and several months later, over 8,000 men and boys in Srebrenica were murdered in a case that the court itself later determined was a case of genocide. And South Africa concluded by saying, this may be your last chance to act before the worst happens.
Certainly, the reality of the World Central Kitchen convoy attack really underscores the reasoning there that, but for a ceasefire, without a ceasefire, the idea of providing humanitarian aid, food, what have you, it's just an impossibility. And it's not an accidental impossibility. It's an impossibility because one might read into Israel's behavior that this is by design, an effort to create conditions that are so unsafe for humanitarian aid that no humanitarian aid gets in, even if it's not UNRWA, which they managed to substantially defund, even if it's not food trucks that are able to get through the various land crossings that they control. Now it is 240 tons of aid that are turned around coming by boat that no longer see themselves as being able to deliver the aid safely because of what's happened to these Jose Andres food trucks.
Yes, I mean, I should start by pointing out that what happened to the gruesome murders of these 7 people, or was it 8? All
it was
1
7,
Palestinian, 7, so 6 international staff of World Central Kitchen and 1 Palestinian staff member. There's nothing remarkable about it. These kinds of attacks have been happening virtually on a daily basis for the past half year, for the past 6 months. What distinguishes this is the identity of those who were targeted and deliberately killed in 3 separate attacks over the course of 2 kilometers. There can be no question but that this was a premeditated, deliberate, organized attack on an organization that had been very closely coordinating with the Israeli military in order to ensure the safety of its staff. And this concoction that the Israelis mistakenly believed there was an armed Palestinian somewhere with them is clearly nothing more than damage control. Norman Finkelstein has recently offered an opinion that I find very persuasive, which is that the medieval siege on the Gaza Strip isn't as effective when you have organizations like World Central Kitchen authorized to deliver urgently needed food assistance to at least some residents of the Gaza Strip, and that among other, and that for those reasons, this attack should be viewed as a deliberate Israeli initiative to plug the hole or plug one of the remaining holes in its siege. And that's certainly how I would see it.
I actually, I'd love to play for you. I was listening to today's episode of The Daily, the New York Times podcast. Armand, I just put this clip in the Slack, and I was gobsmacked. I was walking home from Rising, and I stopped dead in my tracks because I couldn't believe how they were covering, how they were characterizing the, as you described, the deliberate attack, the 3 attacks on the WCK convoy. I want you to listen to this, and I just love to get your reaction.
A series of videos from one of the reporters that I was in touch with, essentially showing 3 cars, all heavily damaged. One had a World Central Kitchen logo on top of it with a gaping hole in the middle of the roof. A second car was completely charred. You could barely recognize the structure of the car. The inside of it had been completely charred and the front smashed.
And do we know if the strike on this convoy was the only strike happening in this area? In other words, is it possible this convoy was caught in some kind of a crossfire or in the middle of a firefight, or does it appear that this was quite narrow? And was the Israeli army targeting these specific vehicles, whether or not they realized who was in it?
We don't have any other indication that there was another strike on that road around that time.
What that suggests, of course, is that this convoy was targeted. Now, whether Israeli officials knew who was in it, whether they were aid workers, seems like a yet unresolved question. But it does feel very clear that the trucks in this convoy were deliberately struck.
Yes, I do think the trucks in this convoy were deliberately struck.
Now, the journalist being interviewed, I think, was doing his best not to recoil in disgust. But Michael Barbaro's questioning and the idea that it's as yet unresolved, a question of whether or not Israel knew who was inside the trucks.
Yes, because it's a tenet of Western journalism that even when the evidence is overwhelmingly staring you in the face, you give Israel the benefit of the doubt. Israel can never possibly be guilty of kinds of behaviors we would blame even ourselves for. It's a case apart. It deserves special treatment. Kid gloves is already too rough for this poor state. This is typical. I should add that in this particular case, Jose Andres, the founder of World Central Kitchen, at the outset of this conflict, and I believe in early October, had actually been defaming the Spanish foreign minister for his criticism of Israel. He was making, expressing his views that we need to stand firmly with Israel against the terrorists. And so, repeating the kind of typical propaganda line at the time. So you would think that his credentials are safe and that given his known earlier expressed views, that he would be given some leeway to express some mild opposition and criticism of the gruesome murder of 7 of his own staff. But what are we seeing now? Now that he has come out and condemned this attack and described it as an attack on humanity and called for a ceasefire, Israel flunkies have gone into overdrive. They're accusing him of blood libel. They're making all kinds of crazy accusations against him, and really giving no quarter. Because if the minute you criticize Israel, all your previous service is forgotten, and you're immediately defamed, delegitimized, demonized, placed beyond the pale, accused of participating in some of the worst persecutions that Jews in Europe have had to endure over the centuries, and so on. It's really phenomenal.
It really is. I'm so glad you brought up that point. I mean, just before we get to the 972 report, I want to come back to the ICJ points you were making a second ago and ask you, whether there is any possibility for accountability on the international stage in the way that we haven't seen domestically. So we see John Kirby saying there is no evidence that Israel acted with intentionality or violated international law. There is no evidence of that. You mentioned that there was an effort to get the ICJ to demand a ceasefire. And I'm curious, even if that were a successful effort, what mechanism exists, even if it's just international pressure? I mean, what difference would that have made? And what difference do any of these ICJ decisions or preliminary decisions make ultimately?
Well, I think it's important. It's an important question, and I'm glad you asked it. We shouldn't think of the International Court of Justice the way you would think, for example, about a criminal court in the United States, where a woman goes to court accusing her ex of stalking her and making violent threats, and the court then orders the police to to arrest this person and lock him up. International Court of Justice does not have enforcement powers. It does not have its own enforcement powers. The only enforcement powers for its rulings are Security Council resolutions that would enforce those. And of course, with the United States being a permanent veto wielding member of the Security Council, that's simply never going to happen. So, regardless of what this court determines or rules, it's not going to have any immediate short-term impact on. It's not going to change anything on the ground, to put it simply. But nevertheless, I do think its judgments have enormous significance. You take simply where we are at this case. Israel draws much of its support in the West. It's formerly bipartisan support from the U.S. political class, previously from broad sections of public opinion in Europe, from its perception as being a form of reparations for the horrible suffering that the Jews of Europe endured over many centuries, and most specifically, the German Holocaust during the Second World War II. Well, that's all changed now, because Israel can no longer use the Holocaust as a shield to deflect any and all criticism made about its own policies towards the Palestinian people. Israel, in the public imagination in the West, I think, is no longer being seen as a victim of genocide, but rather as a perpetrator of genocide. And if you look at what's been happening on the political scene in many Western countries now, and this is not only because of this, it has broader reasons as well, but I think these kinds of issues that have come up in the International Court of Justice are very significant in this respect. You know, kowtowing to Israel has for decades been a vote winner. It's been a surefire way to get elected. Expressing any kind of sympathy for the Palestinians, even acknowledging that they exist in decades past, was a way to immediately end your political career. Israel, you know, slobbering all over Israel used to be an electoral asset. Expressing any kind of sympathy or solidarity with the Palestinians or recognizing their rights was an electoral burden. That has now been completely inverted. Increasingly, alignment with Israel is becoming an electoral burden rather than asset, and supporting Palestinian rights may not necessarily be an electoral asset, but it's no longer the nail in the coffin of a political career. It's no longer the poisoned chalice that it used to. So those are very important things. If I could just make one more point, if
Sure.
I may. There is one other institution, legal institution, which could have a more immediate impact, and that is the International Criminal Court, because while the International Court of Justice deals with states, the International Criminal Court deals with individual criminal liability. So in the case of Ukraine, you know, they've issued an arrest warrant against Vladimir Putin, and they've actually arrested people from a number of other cases and locked them up in The Hague. And so that could have a more direct impact by announcing specific indictments against specific Israeli decision makers. The problem is that the prosecutor of that court, the British prosecutor, Karim Khan, appears to still be on his Christmas holiday, which is expected to probably continue into the next 3 or 4 years.
Are you serious? What do you mean when you say that he is on his Christmas holiday? You're joking? You're saying that he's generally out? That's a metaphor for him being absent at his job or asleep at the wheel?
He won't touch this case with a 10
I see.
until the very end of his tenure, and then he'll probably play the hero, and so he probably will indict a few Palestinians, and for the sake of balance, indict a few violent settlers, but that's not what this is about.
I mean, it's incredible. There were 3 British nationals in that Jose Andres convoy. Three British nationals.
Not only were they 3 British nationals, they're 3 British ex-servicemen, because humanitarian organizations often employ these types when they operate in war zones, and indications are that they were actually killed by British weapons, by British engines supplied to what are apparently the drones that fired the missiles that killed these people.
It's I mean, there's no words. It's disgusting, in the failure of anybody's government to say more than a kind of pat, this was a tragedy, really exposes this weirdly outsized grip power that Israel seems to have in the community. One point I'm just going to make about the realignment that's happening politically with respect to whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, or helpful or detraction for a U.S. politician to bear hug Israel. I take your point. I think you're right about the shifting political winds, but there is a difference between, it seems to me, whether or not the public appreciates your criticism of Israel and whether or not AIPAC and Israeli lobbying groups have the power to still boost your campaign financially and allow you to win. So what we saw in the Nina Turner campaign against Chantel Brown, for example, was that AIPAC was backing Chantel, but wasn't talking about Israel. They were hitting Nina Turner on a bunch of her things, saying that she was, anti-Democrat and anti-Joe Biden, and claiming that Chantel Brown was the real Medicare for all progressive candidate, all of these kinds of things, for the purpose of derailing Nina Turner because she is a pro-Palestinian candidate, but without ever saying anything about it. So it does seem like they still have an outsized power in, there's a reason why politicians still want a bear hug, and it's not because of public opinion, it's because of money.
No, you're completely right. And of course, this is a longer term process and transformation we're discussing, rather than a development that has already occurred. I find it interesting that in the Nina Turner case, in previous years, they would have denounced her as being in bed with terrorists and all the rest of it. And this time, they had to find other excuses to attack, delegitimize her. So that in and of itself, I think, is already a significant change. But, speaking specifically about the United States, Israel is no longer the solid bipartisan cause that it had been for decades. That's already beginning to fray, where Israel is increasingly identified with the radical right in the U.S., and whereas the mainstay of U.S. support for Israel traditionally have been liberal Democrats. So that's already a very significant change. And sorry, I forgot the other point I was going to make, so I'll leave.
Well, let me know if you remember. But you've just reminded me to ask you this. There's been a lot of the pushback from Democrats right now to their base being so disgruntled with Biden and his handling of all of this, is to say, well, Donald Trump is worse. And that has sparked this interesting conversation about, one, whether that matters. If if one candidate has killed 5 members of my family and another candidate would kill 100 members of my family, do I feel especially inclined to vote for the guy that's killed 5 members of my family? But then there's this other kind of substantive question of, what do you think Trump's Israel policy would actually look like, and how would it differ from Biden? Do you think it would be substantively different? Or do you think he's kind of smartly reading the tea leaves and understanding that public opinion on this issue means that he should keep quiet, downplay his own position, float ideas like Bibi's got to wrap this war up, without having to commit to any real policy change. I wonder if you've given that any thought.
Well, I've spoken about the Trump-Biden policy, in the sense that if you look at the key decisions made by Trump during his administration of recognizing Israeli sovereignty over Jerusalem, shutting down the PLO mission in Washington, D.C., and expelling its diplomats, relocating the U.S. Embassy to Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem in violation of UN Security Council resolutions, recognizing Israeli sovereignty over the occupied Syrian Golan Heights, severing U.S. funding to UNRWA. If you look at all those decisions that were taken by Trump, and I should add, these were seen as fundamental changes in U.S. policy when Trump made them, whereas I would argue they were in many respects the logical conclusion of the way the U.S. position on these issues had been changing over decades. And Trump, instead of crawling forward like his predecessors, took that final leap in one fell swoop. But be that as it may, Biden comes into office. Does he withdraw U.S. recognition of Israeli sovereignty over Jerusalem? No. Does he withdraw U.S. recognition of Israeli sovereignty over the occupied Syrian Golan Heights? No. Does he relocate the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem back to Tel Aviv? No. Does he withdraw U.S. recognition of Morocco's illegal annexation of the Western Sahara? No. The only significant change made, and it's not particularly significant when you consider all the Trump policies that he left in place, the only real change made by the Biden administration was to resume U.S. funding to the UN Palestine Refugee Agency, UNRWA. And even that has now again been withdrawn on the basis of this unfounded hoax promoted by Israel that several UNRWA staff members were directly involved in the October 7th attacks in southern Israel.
Yeah.
And so to answer your question, there's always going to be distinctions between one leader and another. But I think, particularly when looking at U.S. policy towards this issue, we should look at it in a broader context of something that has been developing from one administration to the other, rather than a policy that is being reversed by different administrations who are adopting a different course. So, since at least the 1960s, late 1960s, every U.S. president who has left office ends up being hailed by Israel as the best friend Israel has ever had in the White House. And it's always been true. Carter did more for Israel than Nixon. Reagan did more for Israel than Carter, etc. Here with Biden, it may be, he's done so much for Israel in terms of being directly complicit in its genocide, arming the genocide, shielding the genocide from international scrutiny and all the rest of it. And this is a man who has a deep, passionate, personal, ideological, political commitment and attachment to Israel. I think it's going to be a very high bar for the next U.S. president, even if it is Donald Trump, to be hailed as the best friend Israel has ever had in the White House, given that he would have to outdo Joe Biden.
I mean, keeping that in mind, I'm now thinking about the uncommitted movement and the pressure that they're trying to put on the Biden administration to make changes. But it does feel now, and I know this doesn't, what I'm about to say doesn't help the kind of leverage that uncommitted hopes to have, but it does feel now like there is no leverage because there's nothing that can be done that would make so many millions of Americans willing to vote for Joe Biden. Like the ship has already sailed, the Rubicon has been crossed. And yes. I want to put that question to you as someone who, as I understand it, both your parents were made refugees in the Nakba, were expelled from Palestine, who has lived with this, not just as a kind of political abstraction, but as something that very deeply and in a real way impacted your life in the way, in your parents' lives, and the way your family lived over the last 75 years. Do you think it's over for him in terms of being able to shore up any support among the base?
Well, my sense of Biden is that he is so invested in this project named Israel. He is so personally committed to it. He's so passionately attached to it that I don't buy these arguments that he doesn't realize the damage he's doing to himself. My sense is that he's perfectly aware of how this is affecting his chances for re-election. But this is an ideological commitment. Ideological commitments often require sacrifices, and he's prepared to pay the price of standing shoulder to shoulder, not just with Israel, but specifically with Netanyahu, Ben Gvir, and Smotrich, even if it costs him the White House. My sense is, and I readily admit this is at least in part speculation, my sense is that he's aware of the damage and he thinks it's worth the price. Of course, not everyone in this administration is in their 80s, and you have many people in this administration and the broader Democratic Party who would like to see the White House pursue a different policy, either for opportunistic reasons, they don't want to lose their jobs in offices, or because they have genuine principles that they would like to see their party and their leadership implement. But in the U.S. system, the president is an emperor when it comes to foreign policy and can't be challenged really. And all indications is that Biden is determined to stay the course. And additionally, even if he were to completely change course tomorrow and reverse it 180 degrees, what difference would that make? A genocide has already been perpetrated. Tens of thousands of people are already dead, with many tens of thousands of others wounded, perhaps with permanent life-altering injuries. A very large part of the Gaza Strip has been systematically reduced to rubble. There has been a systematic attack on hospitals in the healthcare sector. Famine is taking root, as the International Court of Justice pointed out just last week, in the northern Gaza Strip. And I could go on. Do you get credit when you go to murder an entire family for not plunging that knife through the heart of the last member still alive? I don't think you should.
Yeah, I think you're completely right in that assessment. It feels very much like 2016, like they made the choice to risk losing to run the person that they wanted to run and have the agenda they wanted to agenda. It was better for Hillary to lose than for someone like Bernie to win. And this is a infinitely more weighty, morally and ideologically trade-off that the Democratic Party is demonstrating it's willing to make. Before we run out of time, I really do want to get to this 972 story that I previewed a little bit. So maybe just start by, if you could, explaining what this Lavender AI program is all about.
So this is a major investigative report done, I think, extremely professionally by reporters for a magazine in Israel, which is named Plus 972, which is the country code for Israel, a progressive magazine that has both Israelis and Palestinians among its staff. And I should maybe start by pointing out that Israel operates under strict military censorship. And so there may well be much more to this story than its authors were allowed to publish and release to the public.
So you're saying that the military has to approve reporting that comes out in Israel?
Yes, and it has the right to prevent certain things from being published. So in this case, this report basically explains that Israel is using artificial intelligence to generate targets, and that AI platform, or whatever it's called, Lavender, And then there's a second one called Where's Daddy, which is used to track when people enter their homes. And then I believe there was a third one as well. But what this article makes clear is that on October 7th, the level of involvement a Palestinian in Gaza, had to have with either Hamas or Jihad or one of these other groups was reduced to a very junior level. In other words, anyone who was effectively, even tangentially involved with one of these organizations became considered a legitimate military target. Secondly, the Where's Daddy program focused on attacking these people, not when they were engaged in combat or were in a military installation, but specifically when they entered their private homes. And thirdly, that the level of so-called collateral damage was dramatically raised. So taken together, what this means is, and this is assuming that these AI platforms worked flawlessly, what it means is that the number of people who were earmarked as legitimate military targets was expanded by the tens of thousands. Secondly, that the preferred site in which to hit them were in their homes when they could reasonably be expected to be with their families, or perhaps in an apartment building with many families in it. And third of all, that the number of bystanders or family members who was considered acceptable to kill along with these people was raised to the dozens, and in the case of more senior leaders, to the hundreds. So this was effectively an automated kill machine. And another revelation in this article is that when it came to junior members of Hamas, the preference was to use dumb bombs rather than guided missiles, in many cases, flattening an entire apartment building to get one person who a year ago wasn't even on Israel's radar. You know, this is the equivalent of, let's say, Hasbalah bombing every single private home in Israel where you have at least one family member who has served in the Israeli military, including when they're off duty, including, not necessarily serving in the army as a soldier, but perhaps in some administrative or other capacity. So it's really quite dramatic.
Especially when they're off duty even.
Well,
especially when they're off duty. Purposefully when they're off duty so that you can get the collateral damage of their family members. Daddy's home.
Yes, and that's why I think this strengthens the case against Israel at the International Court of Justice, accusing it of genocide, because there's a preference to kill these people when many others can be killed along with them. And in many cases, or this article also makes the argument that, that there are inherent flaws in the software. But in addition to that, they were so gung-ho to go after so many targets that there were delays occurring. So these platforms may identify you as being home at 8 o'clock, and by the time the air raid comes at 11 o'clock, you're no longer there, but your family and neighbors all get wiped out. There were cases where a home was identified as a target. The person who was supposedly the intended target was no longer there. Even their families were no longer there. But because of the mass displacement in Gaza, there were 2 or 3 other families there. And the article basically shows that this was a system designed to produce mass casualties, and to, in significant part, also meet Israel's insatiable lust for revenge after October 7th, rather than one to eliminate identified targets. And so, in my view, it very much feeds into this argument of of genocide. And the other point I would make is, a lot of people who have read this have become fixated on the software and the AI and so on. And yes, that does certainly raise issues, but I really do think that the primary focus should remain on the policy rather than the mechanisms that were used to implement
Right,
that
because
policy.
the AI is reflective of a policy choice. When you
Exactly.
use a computer program that you know has a 10% error rate, and you accept that it is legitimate and fine to have a 10% error rate when you're killing people, that's a policy choice. And
Yeah.
that's just the error rate right off the bat, assuming that it has like there is a target there to begin with. I want to just read this paragraph that I think underscores the point that you made about the collateral damage. It says, in an unprecedented move, according to two of the sources, the army also decided during the first weeks of the war that for every junior Hamas operative that Lavender marked, it was permissible to kill up to 15 or 20 civilians. That's a policy choice. I'll go on.
Yes.
In the past, the military did not authorize any collateral damage during assassinations of low-ranking militants. The sources added that in the event that the target was a senior Hamas official with the rank of battalion or brigade commander, the army on several occasions authorized the killing of more than 100 civilians in the assassination of a single commander. That's a policy choice.
Yes, and there was another case where I think it rose to 300. It's interesting. In 2002, during the Second Intifada, Israel launched an air raid on an apartment building in Gaza, in the Gaza Strip, to kill a commander of Hamas's military wing, the Qassam brigades, Ibrahim Makadma, and I believe 20 or 25 people were killed, and there was widespread international criticism and in some cases even condemnation. Now this is happening on multiple occasions per day, and it's met with a deafening silence. You use the term collateral damage, which usually means unintended victims of a targeted attack. But I think if you read this article, you begin to realize that these entire families that are being wiped out on a daily basis are not collateral damage. They're the intended targets.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, how can any Israeli now make an argument, or as Israel defender make an argument about human shields with the knowledge that this kind of policy choice has been made?
Yes, I mean, if you make a policy choice that you want to attack these people and kill them while they're in their own homes, sleeping in their beds, in their homes with their families, I mean, it's going to be very hard, I think, to convince anyone but the most hardcore Zionist or Israeli apologist that this is somehow Hamas using the civilian population as human shields. And I should also add, the laws of war are clear. You may be a member of an armed force, but when you're not engaged in combat, when you're sleeping at home, you're not a legitimate target. But just as Israel has rewritten the rules of war to now make attacks on medical facilities and the destruction of hospitals something, a prohibition that has existed almost since the dawn of time. Just as these have now been normalized, so have systematic mass attacks on members of an armed force when they are home with their families, as in a campaign whose purpose appears very much to be at least as much to eliminate the entire families.
I'm glad you made that point, because a rejoinder that I often hear and that my co-host on Rising often made this morning as we were talking about this issue is that war is war. War is terrible, but this isn't something any different than what we've seen in a number of other disputes that you can point to over the course of recent history. And what I hear you saying, and what I've heard the International Criminal Court of Justice and others pointing to is that this is substantively different. This is
Yes.
it is worse than I heard a kind of a liberal commentator on the news this morning saying, in not so many words, this is worse than what Russia is doing in Ukraine. The kill rates, the number of civilian casualties, the number of children dead, the rate of death is scores worse, exponentially worse than what Russia is inflicting on Ukraine. But the tone of how it's described, there is a benefit of the doubt that still is being extended toward Israel, where if Israel's doing it, then it must be just, it must be democratic, it must be
and
okay.
it can't possibly be a war crime. I mean, I'm glad you raised this issue because another point that was raised in this article is that armies generally have legal departments that either sign off or reject decisions made by military commanders. And it compared the Israeli policy to the American policy during the campaign against ISIS. And according to the Americans who were interviewed in this article, let's take it at face value for the sake of argument, their permitted collateral damage for a targeted attack on a junior operative was 0. And in this case, it's 20, but I'm sure as the article makes clear, given the lack of information and so on, in many cases, it was far higher. And so even by the standards of these Western armies that Israel likes to compare itself to, it's completely in a different dimension, completely beyond the pale. And of course, how do the Israelis respond to criticism? Oh, this is double standards. You're holding us to a unique standard, a much higher standard than in any other state in history, and all kinds of whining to that effect. Whereas in fact, as you just mentioned, what the past 6 months have demonstrated is that Israel is not being held to any standard at all. And that's what in many respects makes Israel's conduct unique.
Yeah. Before we wrap, I know that we're already over an hour, but I wanted to give you a chance to talk about the Damascus bombing.
Well, I mean, this is significant because it's a direct attack on sovereign Iranian territory, because the Iranian embassy and its adjoining consular section are under international law considered sovereign territory of the country they represent. And attacks on diplomatic facilities are another one of these things that have been prohibited for centuries. During the Kosovo War, for example, the United States bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, and this was considered such a unacceptable violation of very long-standing practices that the United States went out of its way to try to ameliorate Chinese anger and apologized publicly and went out of its way to explain that this was a mistake and not deliberate, and all the rest of it. And so, it seems to me clear that Israel has now decided that further regional escalation is in its best interests, and that it's seeking to provoke Iran to the point where Iran feels it has to respond decisively, thereby giving Israel a pretext for war. It reminds me of
what end? Sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
to what end? That Israel feels it now has a unique opportunity, particularly with this U.S. president, to fight its regional enemies to the last American, if you will. The U.S. has deployed aircraft carriers to the Eastern Mediterranean to seek to deter Hasbalah and others. The U.S. is actively engaged in the Red Sea already. And I think Israel's wet dream would be to have a direct confrontation between the United States and Iran. I was just earlier saying there's a somewhat similar incident. In 1982, for a year, Israel had been trying to provoke the PLO, which was then based in Lebanon. The PLO had been strictly observing a year-long UN and US brokered ceasefire. I can't remember if it was only the UN or the US. ceasefire, and Israel had been constantly seeking to provoke the PLO in order to then have a pretext to invade Lebanon. PLO wasn't taking the bait, and then there was a shooting attack on Israel's ambassador to the United Kingdom in London, and from the very beginning, everyone knew the attack was carried out by the so-called Abu Nidal organization. I think it was called Fatah Revolutionary Council. This was a group that was not part of the PLO, whose leader had been sentenced to death by the PLO for treason, and who everyone knew had absolutely nothing to do with the PLO. But nevertheless, Israel determined that this was a violation of its ceasefire with the PLO, carried out massive air raids on Beirut and Lebanon that left, I believe, several hundred dead, including in a hospital and so on. The PLO felt it was under so much pressure, it could no longer afford not to respond, fired a few Katyusha rockets into northern Israel, and boom, Israel had its pretext for war, invaded Lebanon, imposed a several months long siege of Beirut, culminating in the Sabra Shatila massacres, which left huge numbers of dead. And what was the West's response throughout this entire ordeal? Israel has the right to self-defense. Does that ring a bell?
Yeah, regrettably, it really does. And I do wonder if that excuse is going to be deployed if this plus 972 article gets any mainstream coverage. And that's a big if in and of itself, right?
Yes.
But how far can you push that excuse? You've seen journalists at these State Department press conferences and the like really pushing at the boundaries of that excuse. There was some great questioning over the past week by people like Niall Stanich and Prem Tucker at the Hill, really pressing, well, is it self-defense? At what point? It's self-defense killing a bunch of humanitarian aid workers? We're talking about Jose Andres, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's months ago, the number was over 100 of humanitarian aid workers that had been killed.
Yeah, but they were Palestinians, so they don't really count. Yeah.
I mean, some of them weren't. Some of them were international UN employee. I mean, they're UN employees. And this is I think the largest number of UN employees that's ever been killed in a single conflict.
Yes, but my understanding is that
all of them were Palestinian.
All of them were Palestinians, so
and therefore irrelevant.
No big deal. Yeah, irrelevant, expendable human scum.
I got to say, on a personal level, my mother worked for the UN in the humanitarian sector for 17 years. I went to international schools. I know you did as well. And the indifference, frankly, that's been shown to human life, obviously more broadly, and specifically Palestinian life, is really something to watch, but especially these foreign nationals, after we heard Joe Biden just say about the 3 service members that were killed in Jordan. When an American is killed, there will be a response. So to the extent that unless what? Unless they're killed by Israel?
Well, unless that American citizen happens to be killed by Israel, and particularly unless that American citizen also happens to be an Arab or a Palestinian.
Yeah, well, this time you got a white guy, the Jose Andres guy. He was, a white man with a young family. I think he had a small baby. I mean, it's no greater than the tragedy of I don't know what number you want to use at this point, 30, 40,000 Palestinians, obviously, who have not just been killed in Gaza, but the survivors who have gone through an extraordinary travesty of an experience and ongoing. When I think about the babies born into those conditions who have died in incubators, the imagery of the people flattened by trucks with their hands tied behind their back, the ongoing starvation, the immiseration, of course, that should be front and center. But there is something really telling that even a good old white American with a nice, wholesome looking family can't provoke our president to stand up to Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli government.
Yeah, no, it's deep personal, ideological, political, passionate attachment that apparently knows no bounds.
I mean, I said this on a recent episode, but frankly, I don't know why I'm surprised, because we watched Israel snipers shoot 3 of its own hostages who were waving white flags months ago. And that has been memory hold to a large extent.
Yes, although at the time, there was the kind of uproar that you can't imagine ever being expressed for any of the Palestinians waving white flags that have been shot to death.
Yeah, in fact, the excuse was, well, don't blame Israel. They thought they were Palestinian.
Well, and not only that, specifically, Israel then issued a statement saying that the soldiers who killed these fleeing hostages were violating their open fire regulations. And it later emerged that, in fact, these soldiers were following orders because that area had been designated as a kill zone where anything that moves is shot to death and then indicated to have been Hamas.
Yeah. Well, look, Mouin Rabbani, I hate to kind of end on that sort of a note, but I don't know what other kind of note there is here talking about this issue. I'm so grateful to you again for joining me today, not just for coming on this podcast, but for speaking everywhere you've been speaking over the past 6 months. You've been truly one of the most powerful, persuasive, and important voices on this issue and in this space. And I'm very, very grateful to you and humbled by your willingness to share all your knowledge with us. Can you tell the audience?
And I'm grateful for your invitation to appear on your podcast. Thank you very much.
Well, tell the audience if there's any other place they should look to find your work, or to find any other appearances, or any other thing that they should know about on the internet or beyond. Yes,
most of my work is published on the website of Jadaliyya, where I'm a co-editor, and that's www.jadaliyya.com.
All right. Thank you again for that. And thank you, listeners, for supporting and listening to this podcast. If you want an additional episode every week, you can go to patreon.com/badfaithpodcast and get access to both the backlogs and all the premium episodes, and this week's most recent premium episode with Mouin's debate partner, Norm Finkelstein. You can find it there. Again, thank you for listening. Take care of yourselves and keep the faith. Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.